Welcome to another episode of the Edmonds Mom's Room podcast. I'm Dr. Allison Felt, owner of Body Motion Physical Therapy, and we are continuing our amazing birth series podcast about birth stories. And I am delighted to have Kaitlin here with us today to share her birth experience and really the kind of work and what she did to prep her body for her most recent birth, which was a VBAC. So it was a vaginal delivery after cesarean. And she is here to share about it. And I am really excited because one of the important things is putting out positive birth stories. And I think it's easy to find things that are trauma filled and hard to, are kind of scary. And so this whole series is about sharing what's possible with birth and also the reality of birth too. So there is that as well. So Kaitlin, thank you for being here, and I'm excited to have you on.
Yeah, me too.
Well, welcome. So Kaitlin, I got to meet you during your first pregnancy with your daughter she's almost 3.
Yeah, she's 3 in July.
3 in July. So you were pregnant 3 years ago, and I got to work with you during that pregnancy. At that time, we weren't doing much we didn't do internal work during pregnancy. And we focused a ton on your pelvis, opening everything up externally. And you ended up with a C-section during that, with your delivery of Esme. And so one of the things you were really hoping to achieve was to have this vaginal birth on with this next baby. And spoiler alert, you had that and were able to achieve it. So do you mind sharing, I guess if you're comfortable with sharing some of the experience from the first birth? They were both hospital births, so that's great for the listeners to know. But do you mind sharing your first birth experience and kind of what you went through, the prep you did for birth and that kind of stuff, and then we'll compare it to the second?
Yeah, sure. So for the birth of my first daughter, Esme, I, started that pregnancy out actually in the middle of training for a half marathon. I was in pretty good shape. I did stop doing that around 9 miles, and I remember that just getting too difficult. And so I started doing some more pregnancy specific exercise with a studio at the time. And that was kind of how I found Allison and started doing PT. I can't remember exactly at what point in my pregnancy. It was probably a little later, maybe 3rd trimester even, to do some of that external work to prepare for pregnancy. So I was exercising and I was in decent shape, and then, doing PT to try and just be in shape for that delivery and for the postpartum period. I had a pretty easy pregnancy, nothing complicated, no difficult, no medical issues or anything like that. And was working with the midwives at Northwest Hospital. They were great. And then ultimately when I, came up on my due date, that came and went. Esme was 10 days late. I went into labor on my own 10 days late. And again, everything had been fine and normal. I guess one thing I would add is that, I did work up until the day before I went into labor. So I worked 9 days past my due date, sitting in a chair at a computer. And I mentioned that because I changed that the second time around. So, I definitely wasn't optimizing my body during the day, at least, for that delivery. So anyway, I went into labor and on my own, and labored until 6 centimeters at home, got to the hospital, everything seemed kind of normal. And then when I got to the hospital, it kind of stalled out for like many, many hours. And so at some point it was too painful and was still at 6 centimeters, was having full on back labor the entire time. And went for an epidural, and I actually, they got the epidural in, and I just was with the epidural, tried to sleep overnight. So I don't, my memory of the hours is so blurry, but it was many, many hours. And eventually they decided to add some Pitocin to that labor to see if they could get me further, because I was still stuck at that 6 centimeters. That did help. And eventually I did get to 10 centimeters with the Pitocin help. But I had a lot of really irregular contractions, and Esme was still super high. So once I did get to complete, I did push for about 4 hours, which in a hospital setting, that's kind of their, when you get to 4 hours, you start talking about other options, because that's kind of their limit. And so kudos to Northwest. They, took a look, they tried to see if there were other options like vacuum and everything else, but Esme was still super, super high. She just had not come down in the pelvis, even though I was complete. And so they recommended a C-section after that 4 hours of pushing. They gave my husband and I 30 minutes to kind of talk about it. And I just mentioned all of that because I would say, as far as C-sections go, it wasn't that traumatic, and I was really supported by my hospital. It was traumatic in that it wasn't what I wanted. But we ultimately decided to go ahead and do that because there were also, heart decels with the monitors, and it had been a long time. And so we had that C-section, and she was finally delivered after 30 hours of labor and pushing. So wow. That's my first experience. It wasn't what I wanted. I would also say though, like it wasn't awful either. I was well supported by providers, but and it was a gentle C-section. They offered to let me watch it. I didn't ultimately do that, but they were really lovely. But
what else do they offer for gentle C-sections, just for our listeners, if you don't mind sharing?
Yeah, so they offer to have a clear drape so that you can watch the baby being born if you'd like. And then they, still do delayed cord clamping. They pretty much everything with a vaginal birth, they try to make it as close as possible to that, other than, of course, the fact that they're opening you up. So Esme was on my chest almost immediately afterwards, just, as soon as she I'd say it was less than a minute. So nursing in the OR. So that's kind of what that looks like. There are probably more things and I just don't remember, but pretty much assume it's almost identical to a vaginal birth other than the surgery itself. So which is great.
Yeah. And I think that Northwest does it really well, compared to some of the stories I've heard from other places. So I appreciate totally. You sharing that. So it didn't end up being what you wanted. You had a C-section, ended up going through recovery. We worked together to heal that scar tissue. And then that's when we really dove into the internal pelvic floor. So we really figured out after that cesarean that floor was really, really tight. So tight that the first few times we even started to do any releases internally, you had a lot of nausea and just feelings of sickness, and it was kind of a visceral experience, almost it was just that uncomfortable. And now the tightness from the pelvic floor can also be from the cesarean itself, but most likely this was something that you probably had before you even conceived, is just that really tight hypertonic pelvic floor where it's hard for you to relax your pelvic floor. And so we went through really helping your pelvis get to a good place, pelvic floor internally, healing that scar tissue. Your core came back pretty well, really quickly from that first delivery. And we got dogs, we got kids. It's awesome. Totally fine. Totally okay. So anyways, you had a great recovery. You kind of we stayed together working on maintenance really throughout that whole 3 years. And it was probably 2, and then you conceived. Yeah. So then that brings us to your prenatal experience, kind of your pregnancy this time around. Do you mind sharing what you did during pregnancy this go around and what was kind of different?
Yeah. So, I mean, right away, you and I had discussed, doing internal work throughout my pregnancy, not to mention just starting PT from day one as opposed to in the third trimester. And the first trimester, we actually didn't do internal work because I had what was called a subchorionic hemorrhage. So it was just some bleeding in the first trimester, nothing super dangerous, but just to be extra cautious, we held off probably until 12 weeks or so, I think.
We started that internal after your bleeding had subsided.
Yeah, we started the
The
internal work around,
the obese.
12 weeks, and the bleeding had kind of gone away. And
Can I back you up just a second?
yeah.
I think one of the things that it's important to say is that you really knew you wanted a VBAC from the very beginning. And so you found a doctor who is really specialized in having this vaginal birth after delivery. She's one of the best in the area. She's well known for it. She's had one herself, I believe. Is that correct?
Yeah, so actually, I mean, I guess a piece of my C-section story I did not mention was that the day after in the hospital, that doctor, so Dr. Panaghetti, Anna Panaghetti, happened to visit me. She happened to be on call at the hospital and just talked to me about, my experience the day after I gave birth and, just said, that doesn't have to be the end of the story. You can have a VBAC. She told me all about her own experience the first time I met her. And so I actually sought her out because I just remembered her and that being really comforting, right after having an experience that you didn't really want to have. So I sought her out right away. And so it was a great start to the pregnancy just because we chatted about the options. And yeah, she's super supportive. She's also super supportive of choices. So like she would be super supportive of someone who also chose a repeat C-section. And I thought that was really helpful. It was just, she remained really neutral, gives you the evidence and of either option and what the risks and benefits are to both. And so, yeah, I mean, I think I started out on the right foot and just had lots of choices that, I was able to make empowered choices, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. So we started internal from the beginning. Really, your pelvic floor therapy course we did a lot of internal, we did a lot of external, just opening up your entire pelvis, making sure your pelvic floor could contract, relax, and overstretch. We spent a lot of time overstretching your pelvic floor, so it would be ready for the experience of delivering.
Yep.
We did that throughout your entire pregnancy. Worked on some visualization, worked on some learning how to push in different positions, and yeah, and talking about like really what you wanted this ideal birth to look like. And I thought that was, and it turned out it was, you got to be one of the 80% of VBACs that are successful, which is really cool.
Yeah.
And I think everything you did really from an educational standpoint and just empowering yourself and then optimizing your body was pretty amazing. Do you mind sharing some of the other things, maybe the childbirth education that you sought out and some of the other care that you had during pregnancy?
Yeah. So I also worked with a chiropractor more towards the end of the second and first part of the third trimester, just for alignment. And, it was kind of like, I'll just do everything that I can to make sure that we could get baby in the right position. I think both through you and through the chiropractor, we worked a lot on SI because my hips were always kind of off.
Yeah.
And it was hard to keep them in line, but just continually doing that, I'm sure made it, a lot better than it could have been. And I also took a VBAC Your Way class through Sharon Muja. It was just for one day, but kind of just talking about all of that class was really helpful in terms of talking about all the options, what it looks like to have a VBAC supportive provider, and then, sort of additional options for ways to push, for things for dealing with back labor, which I had during my first labor. So that those kinds of things in that class. And that was really nice, just to kind of round out what I had already done on my own in terms of researching what this experience should or would be like going into labor.
That's fantastic. Thank you for
And I guess,
sharing.
Sorry, I'll add one more. I also worked with pronatal fitness through Cat Williams, and it's just a pregnancy fitness class for, I think was in her classes for about 6 months. I did stop at the very end. But that was really great too. It just complemented everything we did at PT. She also worked on a lot of stuff that, helps with postpartum. Like I joked with her about how great it was that we would lift and bend down with 8 pound, 9 pound bags of stuff,
Yeah.
so that you're ready to sort of be lifting that baby and doing all the things postpartum. So
Yeah, that's great. I love that everyone you've mentioned has already been on the podcast.
oh, well,
That's pretty cool. Yeah. Oh, that's lovely. And I think that's really good. I mean, it just shows that like you took initiative and really to do everything you could to get your body in this position. Do you mind sharing your birth story?
no, not at all. So with so Astrid, I did not go into labor on my own. So my babies like to stay in the womb. um, so I was induced 10 days. So similar to Esme, but I didn't go into labor on my own. I was induced 10 days late again. And I guess I'll stop there and just mention that they will induce for a VBAC, at least at Northwest. There are certain things that they have to do. So my induction was on a Tuesday. The hospital was super busy. So for anyone getting induced, like because you're not in labor, it can take some time because it's not an emergency.
Yeah, yeah.
So they were super busy. So we were supposed to get induced at 5-ish. Ended up being more like 10 p.m. It was a Cook's catheter is what it's called, which is a balloon both inside your cervix and in the vagina. That there's two balloons and they both get inflated with liquid, and then that forces your cervix to dilate, and your body contracts a little bit, or at least mine did a little bit, and got me to about 5 centimeters. That took overnight. In my experience, just putting it in was a little uncomfortable, but it wasn't that painful, and the contractions weren't that crazy. So for me, it was a relatively easy experience. I took a Benadryl and slept through the night. And then the next morning, they took a look, and that the Cook's catheter had done its job. The reason they use that when you're going for a VBAC is they can't use some of the medications they might use if you hadn't had a C-section. So that was kind of my only option for getting my cervix ripened, because I wasn't dilated, not even 1 centimeter. So this baby wasn't not coming. So that's how they did cervical ripening. And then, the next morning, we talked about starting Pitocin. Again, the hospital was super busy. So it took several hours yet again before they were able to start me. So I think it was like 1 or 2 in the afternoon. We started the Pitocin at pretty low levels. And they just kind of bump it up over time. So they were just kind of going one at a time with the Pitocin, and I was having some contractions, but they were super minor for quite a while. So much so that around 5-ish, I ate a full Thai dinner, kind of in preparation for, hey, let's just get some food in my body to have some energy for when this actually does kick in. Then I would say probably, what's that?
That's my favorite part of your story.
The dinner.
No, it's not.
I'm not sure that was the smartest decision I've ever made, but I did have energy.
Exactly. That was maybe the smartest thing you did do.
So I think labor kind of kicked in full bore probably 2 or 3 hours after that dinner. And they had been upping the Pitocin. I would say the one thing that was hard about this labor was that it went from, this is no big deal and I'm eating dinner, to, oh my God, I'm like, the contractions were really intense, which I think you hear a lot with Pitocin. And so, it got real intense real fast. I eventually decided to just check and see where we were at, because I was struggling with the pain. And when I was at about between 7 and 8 centimeters, I decided to go ahead and get an epidural because I was really struggling with the intensity of that. I discovered I am not a bathtub girl, and I am not a nitrous person. Neither of those things were really working for me. In fact, I was also at the point where even when, you know, there are things like hip squeezes and types of massage that your doula can try. And I did have a doula. She was great, but none of that stuff was working for me. I didn't want to be touched. So the epidural seemed like the right decision for me at that time. And it did provide a lot of relief. I actually, this epidural was better than the one I had with my C-section, in that it seemed like it didn't affect me quite as much. So I had a little more movement, which was great. Which was great for me. And then once that epidural was in, another 2 or 3 hours, and ended up, at 10 centimeters. So it was a fairly quick, what is that? It was somewhere between 5 and 6 hours to, once things got rolling, to get to 10. And then, the OB, at the time recommended I just kind of hang out for a little while. So she thought maybe an hour or so, and then we could kind of see if baby was a little bit further down for pushing. It did not take an hour to get to that place where I was like, whoops, this baby's got to come out. So probably about 30 minutes later, I felt that, the pressure that people talk about, which I had never felt with my first one. So this was a new feeling for me. We decided to go ahead and get started with the pushing. At this point, there were a lot so with a VBAC at Northwest, and I suspect it's similar at other hospitals, you do have to have, what do they call it? Not intermittent monitoring, it's constant monitoring. So I had the heart rate monitor for the baby on my belly, and they were starting to see decels, depending on the position that I was in. So the only position I could really push on was on my left side. Otherwise, they would that heart rate would kind of disappear on them. So I hung out on my left side, and they did end up putting, they also have heart rate monitors they can put actually on the baby's head. I believe that's how that works. So they did end up doing that so that they could kind of get a better sense of that, and suspected that there was a cord wrapped around, because every time baby kind of got closer, that's when those heart rate things went down. And this, I think, my sense is that this is pretty common. But the OB was kind of saying, well, we got to get this baby out, soon. So that gave me a sense of urgency around it. Cause I went, okay, like I'm not having another C-section. That's not happening. So just really went for it. It was a combination of, I had practiced pushing with Dr. Allison that was more using your breath to push, so that it's not as hard on your pelvic floor. It was a combination of that and some breath holding, because, there was some sense of urgency. And so I would say it was a mix of that. And you kind of got to push in a way that works for you, but that was working for us. And anyway, after about 2.5 hours, baby was like right there, but kind of getting stuck because the cord was indeed wrapped around her neck. And so on the final push, baby's head was really already halfway out. They just put a vacuum on her head to make sure she could get all the way out on that last push. And there she went. And they just grabbed that cord right off. And she was blue for about 30 seconds, but she was totally, totally fine. They had brought in a NICU nurse just to make sure. And that NICU nurse saw Astrid and went, oh, she's good, and left the room. So that was really nice for me, just no worries. And then just really exciting to that sense of relief to say, oh, I do not have to get surgery. It's done. And it was done so much faster. So it was about an 8-hour birth compared, for, the active part of the birth, compared to a 30-hour birth. Just such a different experience. And then just like the gentle C-section, cord cutting, immediate baby on chest. This baby pooped all over me, which was pretty amusing. Everybody was kind of laughing about that. But she within 5 minutes was latched, which was super cool. And, I think being a second time mom helped because I I knew what I was doing. I knew what a baby latched was like. So if you're first time mom, don't expect that to happen right away. But yeah, that, everything about that was awesome. And it was just a huge sense of relief, and really fun to kind of be able to go, oh, okay, like I know what it's like to give birth in two ways now, and just really be able to compare those experiences. And um the biggest piece of it, I guess, was just having energy afterwards. Like I just don't even hardly remember the hours after Esme was born, because I was so tired. And this time, I remember all of it, and it's very clear, and that's just a lovely feeling, and it's lovely to have that experience. So that's kind of, I think I got it all. Did I miss anything that I had told you before?
No, I absolutely loved it. I thought it was great. Thank you for sharing it. One of the things that I did after we chatted before, I did research on the breath holding patterns versus the breathing patterns to push the baby out. And for anyone listening to this, you want to make sure that you can coordinate your pushing with your breathing, or you're pushing with your breath holding, if that's the pattern that you're going to use. One of the things, Kaitlin, if you don't mind me sharing, Kaitlin was shocked that the nurses all decided to teach her or tell her how to push with breath holding, and her doula was also coaching her in that way. And that was pretty surprising, because everything we practiced was practicing about breathing this baby out. And so when she spoke with the OB afterwards, Dr. Panaghetti had said, well, in more emergent situations, or if they want you to just get this baby out, they will have you do the breath holding. And that is what the research shows. So the research does show that breath holding might be quicker. And it might be quicker, like, how research is, it's vague. And however, breathing the baby out is there's a lot less trauma on the pelvic floor. So a lot less tearing, a lot less bleeding, et cetera, et cetera. So, if the baby has to come out really fast, it is more common for the breath holding patterns of pushing to be the ones that are going to be recommended in the hospital. However, I do think that is pretty much all that's ever recommended in the hospital. And I'm just going to plug here. Obviously, I'm biased, but this is why everyone needs to have pelvic floor therapy before they give birth, is so they can know what their pattern is, and exactly when they inhale, what their pelvic floor is doing, and when they go to push, what their pelvic floor is doing. Because if you just go into this blind, it's kind of just like a crapshoot, right? Like, you don't know what your body is actually doing, especially if you have an epidural and you haven't trained. You don't know if you, like, are you feeling the right things? You feel the pressure, but you don't necessarily feel like the coordination of the muscle. And even if you don't have an epidural, there's so much pressure and for some people, discomfort, that you don't actually feel the muscles themselves. So that's the importance of training, in my opinion, is just going through and knowing what's happening. When you retold the story to me, you did mention that when you were breathing is when you could feel her kind of descend through your, descend and open. And it was hard for
Yeah.
you to coordinate with your pelvic floor when you were breath holding.
Yeah, so we kind of, by the way, my doula was awesome. So, she and the nurses and the doctor did all sort of like I think they call it directed pushing, where it was, they were telling me what to do, when to breathe kind of thing, and when to hold my breath. And said, hold your breath for 10 seconds at the beginning. And I, kind of said to my doula, I said, well, this isn't what I sort of thought I was going to do. Can I try something else? And, and they were like, yeah, do it, So everyone was super supportive of me trying something else. And ultimately what seemed to work well for, speeding things up, but also for me to be able to kind of feel that coordination, was to breathe at the beginning of every push, and then to sort of hold the breath at the end. And so I would kind of breathe right at the beginning, so I could really feel that pelvic floor, especially with the epidural. And then it was like, okay, I can feel this. Now I can really, use the breath holding to get some oomph behind it. So that's ultimately what I ended up doing. So it was a combination of both. But I was lucky enough that, like I said, I think I felt a little more with this epidural. So it was really, I could feel it. I wasn't, there wasn't no sensation at all.
Right.
Especially because I was on my left side, and the way that the epidural worked was that my my left leg was kind of numb, but my right leg definitely wasn't. And because it, gravity.
Yeah.
So I think that also helped to just have some feeling. And so anyway, that's kind of how that ended up working. I didn't mention, I did, end up tearing. It was a second-degree tear. It wasn't horrible, but I did end up tearing. And so I'm sure that probably had some, something to do with it. But again, baby came out and we didn't end up in surgery. So it's a victory.
100%. And when you tear, if you tear these muscles and they have no blood flow and they're not used to being stretched, that tear is more significant. You build up more scar tissue. It doesn't heal as quickly. It's like tearing a piece of beef jerky versus if you have like a nice steak and you tear a piece of steak, you can like, when it comes back together, like you can almost not see it. Do you know what I'm talking about? Like if you're just checking the meat, I know that's just not the greatest example, but it's kind of gross, I guess, for some people maybe, but it's really true. So like you've done all this work prenatally, you've gotten all this blood flow to your pelvic floor. Your pelvic floor knows how to stretch. And so I think this healing for you, what you're probably already experiencing and what you're going to experience further is that this scar tissue is almost going to be insignificant, and will heal really quickly because you already have that dynamic motion of the pelvic floor. It already has the blood flow. So you're in a really good position. So, well, thank you so much for sharing this. This was great.
Yeah, totally.
I think it's going to be really inspirational for a lot of people out there that are going through their pregnancy, preparing for birth, and really, especially anyone who's had a VBAC. I think this is such a great story. So I'm honestly on cloud 9 that you get to be on this podcast and be here and talking about it. And just the fact that you had a VBAC, I mean, my heart was so warm the minute I got your text. It's so special. So I'm really impressed. I'm so honored to be on this journey with you.
Thank you. Yeah. No, me too. So.
The Edmonds Mom's Room podcast is brought to you by Body Motion Physical Therapy. We help women through pregnancy and beyond so they can live active, confident, and healthy lives.